Chapter 8, Thursday, October 6, 1774. There was no longer any doubt that war with the whites was very near. In the weeks and months following Blue Jacket's warning to Chief Logan, matters had gone from bad to worse. It gave the young Shawnee no pleasure to know that Logan's blindness to the warning had resulted in a severe blow to him. On April 30th, 3 days after he had left Logan's Yellow Creek village, a party of white men had ambushed a large group of Logan's men, women, and children. All but 3 of the Indians had been killed, and among the dead were all the remaining relatives of the influential chief, including his brother, sister, father, and brother-in-law. Even after they were dead or wounded, the most horrible atrocities had been committed upon their bodies. Logan's sister, for example, heavy with child, had tried to flee and was wounded with a bullet in her back. They had tied her by her wrists to a tree branch with her feet off the ground and then tomahawked her. When Logan himself, alerted by the 3 survivors, arrived on the scene the next morning, an overpowering rage struck him. He declared war against the whites, buried his dead, and vowed he would not ground his tomahawk again until he personally had killed 10 whites for every Indian who had fallen there. Then, to aid the Shawnee and also to have his remaining people protected by them, he moved to a place near Kispoko town. Killings became frequent in border skirmishes, and an all-out war seemed inevitable. Then there was a sudden ray of hope. Chief Cornstalk was invited to come to Fort Pitt, where the Monongahela and the Allegheny joined to form the Ohio River, there to discuss a new treaty. But because of high feelings running against the Indians, he was asked to come only with a small company instead of the usual large following for such affairs. Cornstalk agreed and took with him only his younger brother, Silverheels, and his gigantic sister, Nanhelema, whom the whites knew as the Grenadier Squaw. But the 3 had no sooner arrived at Fort Pitt than a mob rushed them, and Silverheels was stabbed deeply in the chest. Nanhelema and Cornstalk managed to escape, carrying their wounded brother, but from that instant on, all hope of peace was shattered. For his own part, Blue Jacket was eager for war, eager for a chance to retaliate for the murder of his 2 companions, and for an opportunity to drive the whites back across the Appalachians. Most of the younger braves and many of the older ones felt the same. The first thrust of the army, however, came not at the Scioto River villages, but rather at the half-dozen villages collectively called Wapatamico. These were located far to the north and east of the Kispoko town above the fork of the Muskingum River. At the approach of General MacDonald's army in midsummer, the entire population abandoned the towns and fled to the west. At the headwaters of the Mad River, close to the villages of the Mekuje Shawnee, they established a new Wapatomica. MacDonald had had to content himself with merely destroying the deserted villages. Then he returned to Fort Pitt. By the end of September, the blood of many settlers and Indians had been spilled on the frontier, and now an army of 2 divisions was advancing, this time against the Scioto River villages. One of the wings of the army was under Lord Dunmore, governor of the colony of Virginia. It was presently floating down the Ohio River, planning to join at Point Pleasant at the mouth of the great Kanawha River, where the southern wing of the army, led by Colonel Andrew Lewis. There was the situation when Chief Cornstalk called an early morning council of the Shawnee of the Scioto River villages. It was a large council and an angry one. For the first time since he had become principal chief, Cornstalk's advice and counsel had been overruled. The stand he was taking was not a popular one, especially in view of what had happened at Fort Pitt. Cornstalk had not become one of the greatest chiefs in Shawnee history by avoiding battle. He was, in fact, a daring and courageous leader who had often led his warriors in successful attacks against their enemies. But this time he urged his tribesmen to consider again what was in store and what to make another effort to establish peace with the whites. "We are 800 Shawnee warriors," he told them in the final council. "Even with the aid of our brothers, the Cayugas, Senecas, Delawares, and Wyandots, we are only 1,000 strong. The Shawnees, the Long Knives, have 3 men or more to our 1, and their guns are newer and better. I ask you once again, think to the future of our race." His plea made little impression. They had had enough of peacemaking. Now was a time of war, and if Cornstalk would not lead them, then they would be led by Puxinwau and Blacksnake. There was no other way. Reluctantly, Cornstalk agreed. For some hours after that, they listened to reports of spies who had been watching both wings of the advancing army. The White Father, Lord Dunmore, had the most men, but he was still up the Spele Lethipi at the white settlement that had first been called Zane's Station, but which had recently been renamed Wheeling. It would be many days before he could reach the great Kanawha. On the other hand, the white warrior chief named Lewis was almost at that point already, and his force was much smaller than Dunmore's, not much larger, in fact, than their own. In addition, a detachment of 300 of Lewis's men was a full day behind the main thrust, bringing up the beef cattle and supplies. If the Indian force could strike while Lewis had only 800 men, it would have a distinct advantage, even though the army was far better armed. Cornstalk listened carefully and then nodded and arose to speak a final time. "We will leave at once," he said, "to attack the Shawnee under Lewis. But remember this, now there will be no turning back. Now the seed of war has been planted and watered, and already it sprouts. Whether it thrives and grows or is cut down remains yet to be seen." Within the hour, they were riding southeastward towards the hill country of Ohio along the trail which would take them directly to the mouth of the Great Kanawha. The large procession was led by 3 riders, Cornstalk in the middle, flanked on his left by the huge Nanhalema, and on his right by Silverheels, who was still recovering from his wound but refused to be left behind. A short distance beyond these 3 rode Puxenwa and his quiet but devoted Lieutenant Blacksnake. Flanking this pair were 2 young men, their eyes alight with excitement and anticipation. It would be their first battle with the Shawnee, and they were eager to prove themselves. To the left of the chief of the Kispokothos, tall and strong upon the back of a chestnut mare, rode his 18-year-old son Chiksika, and to the right of Blacksnake and a dappled gray rode the remarkably well-muscled 20-year-old called Blue Jacket. Chapter 9. Monday, October 10th, 1774. The crossing of the Spele Lethipi had been done simply and silently, with no one in the enemy camp aware of what was happening. The Indian force had arrived just after dark last night at the river, and 1,000 pairs of eyes peered from cover to the crude fortification that had been thrown together by the weary army. A whispered council was held, and a plan agreed upon by the principal battle chiefs, Cornstalk, Puxenwa, Logan, Blacksnake, Red Hawk, Wolf, and Elinipsiko, the son of Cornstalk. They would be moving upriver a mile and cross over silently in the light bark canoes that had been carried along, strapped between horses, each craft capable of ferrying 10 men at a time. The position of the army on the triangular point of land would make it difficult to attack. With the Kanawha and the Spele Lethipi joining behind them, it would be next to impossible to flank them, meaning a frontal attack would be necessary. The attack would begin at dawn, and with Moneta at their sides to protect and guide them, the Indians were confident they would wipe out the whole force. At the first gray light of morning began outlining the hills behind them, a line of 1,000 painted warriors began creeping forward. Instants later, a gunshot sounded as a sentry fired at an Indian and missed, but paid with his life for it as several balls struck him in return. There was frantic activity in the camp, as Colonel Andrew Lewis ordered a counterattack in 3 wings, leading the center himself. The Kanawha side was led by his brother Charles, and the Ohio side by James Fleming, both of whom were colonels too. The lines were hastily formed and moved out abreast to meet the Indians. The scattered firing suddenly turned into a wild barrage, and in the first firing, Colonel Charles Lewis was killed as a ball tore through his skull. At almost the same time, on the other end of the line, Colonel Fleming was put out of action when a shot passed through his body just beneath his ribs. The first onslaught of the Indians was strong and broke the line of defenders, forcing them to come to ground for some minutes until they took cover behind logs, trees, rocks, or anything else that might provide protection from the withering fire. Back and forth through the morning hours, the battle raged. First the whites giving ground, then the Indians. Never before had Blue Jacket felt so alive, so powerful, so filled with lust for blood. Before him and behind him, all around, was incredible din, a rising and falling chorus of screams, of harsh cries, gunfire and grunts, curses and moans. The acrid gun smoke was thick now and lay close to the ground, hiding both friends and enemies in a blue-white screen. The eyes of everyone streamed tears as they blinked against the burning it caused. Bodies lay everywhere. After firing his flintlock only twice, Blue Jacket threw the clumsy weapon aside and relied on his bow until his quiver was empty. Few of his arrows missed their mark. When they were gone, he discarded bow and quiver and darted about, tomahawk in one hand and knife in the other, engaging each wight he encountered in mortal combat. 5, 6, 7 times he left behind him the bodies of militiamen, pausing only an instant after each had fallen to cut off the scalp and scream in triumph and defiance. A bullet had grazed his neck, and the blood streaming down his broad chest and back mingled with the black and white paints with which he had decorated himself. It gave him the appearance of some fantastic devil. More than one white man dropped his weapon and fled in panic when Blue Jacket loomed before him. Puxenwa and Chiksika fought side by side in the first battle father and son had ever shared, but just before noon, a bullet smashed into the war chief's breast and felled him. Stunned, Chiksika cradled his father's head and wept unashamedly. With his dying breaths, Puxenwa spoke faintly. Chiksika, your turn now. Head of family. Preserve its honor and dignity. Never give in to whites. Teach Tecumseh triplets ways of war, courage, stamina, ability in battle. Provide for mother and... He wheezed faintly and relaxed in death. All morning long, up and down the line, could be heard the deep, powerful voice of Cornstalk, urging his warriors on with praise when they were fighting well, rallying them when they were weakened by cries of Oishi Katoi, be strong, be strong. Still weak from the chest wound suffered at Fort Pitt, Silver Heels fought doggedly near his brother until he collapsed with exhaustion and was picked up and carried out of the battle by the only woman who fought there, 6.5-foot Nanhalema. For 5 hours they fought at a feverish pitch within a line less than 200 yards deep and along a mile of a corridor. Occasionally firing came after that, but not a great deal. Still the smoke hung heavily, and the crouching soldiers prayed for a breeze to sweep it away so that they might be able to see their foe. But word had come to Cornstalk now that the 300-man rear guard was coming up rapidly, and he sent runners to pass the word to withdrawal. So they did, under cover of the smoke screen, taking along with them all their dead and wounded. It was early evening when the rear guard arrived, and Colonel Andrew Lewis mounted an attack. By then, however, not an Indian remained on his side of the river. The soldiers were jubilant at what they quickly began calling their victory. But this so-called victory was a hollow one indeed. They had lost more than half of their officers and 52 militiamen, for a total of 75 men dead. There were also 140 men injured, of whom 88 would do no more fighting. The Indians, on the other hand, had lost a total of 22 killed and only 18 wounded, of whom only 5 were so badly wounded they would not fight again. All the way back to Kispoko Town, Chiksika rode with his dead father cradled in his arms. Though the tears were gone now, his face was frozen in an expression of deep inner pain. Close beside him, ready to help should the arms of his young companion begin to fail, rode Blue Jacket, and his cheeks were still wet. Chapter 10, Thursday, November 10th, 1774. A month had passed since the single battle in what was now being called Lord Dunmore's War. There might well have been more, but the war fever that had filled many of the Indians before the fight at Point Pleasant cooled off quickly during the ride back to the Scioto villages. Hardly had they returned across the Spele-Wathipi and begun the return, in fact, than the allies of the Shawnee deserted them. Without counsel with Cornstalk, without even a word of explanation, the Mingo, Delaware, and Wyandot abruptly broke away from the procession and struck out for their own home areas by different routes, looking fearfully over their shoulders for pursuers. This was an act of thorough cowardice and desertion. They were, in a manner of speaking, throwing the Shawnee to the wolves. Dunmore's army, nearly 3 times as large as that of Lewis's, was camped at the mouth of the Hocking River, now known as the Hocking River, and prepared to thrust directly westward to the Scioto villages. Lewis's army would sweep up from the south to meet Dunmore's there. The villages of the Wyandot, Mingo, and Delaware were more distant and out of the path of the army. It was the Shawnee, therefore, who would now have to bear the brunt of the retaliation. A great contempt filled Cornstalk. He did not bid them stay, nor did he call them cowards, but their eyes dropped before his cold gaze. They rode away with a permanent cloak of shame over their shoulders. Only Logan of them all remained to stand by the Shawnee in whatever should come now. Cornstalk permitted no stopping until the Scioto villages were reached, but his disgust and contempt turned to anger as he heard his own warriors behind him speaking not of further battle, but of suing for peace before the army should close upon them and crush them. Black Snake, riding close to Chicksika and Blue Jacket, had been openly scornful of the frightened quail riding behind them, and as angry with them as was Cornstalk. He shot a glance at Blue Jacket, and his voice was bitter. "And are you, like these others, trembling with fear at what might come now?" Blue Jacket's gaze locked on that of the new chief of the Kispokotha Shawnee, which was what Black Snake had become with the death of Pucksinwah. The young man was desperately weary, but his own voice was full and firm of conviction. "I do not dream of peace," he said quietly. "Pucksinwah said many times there could never be peace between Indians and whites, and he was right. I will fight beside you, Black Snake, as long as there is breath in me to fight, and should you be killed, I will still continue to fight to the end." Chief Black Snake merely grunted, but in his eyes was reflected a deep respect for Blue Jacket. In the battle he had seen him rush ahead, where other Kispokothas had fallen back. He had seen him strike one enemy after another, exulting in the battle and exhibiting a fierceness he had rarely witnessed in another. Blue Jacket was an outstanding warrior, but the personal desire to fight on was taken out of their hands. Cornstalk had called for a general council meeting immediately upon their return to the villages. The gathering was strangely subdued. "You have fought well, my children," the principal chief told them, "and the heart of the Hokolesqua sings the song of praise for your strength in battle, just as it sings the song of mourning for our brave warriors and chiefs who fell. Now, I must ask you, was this all in vain? A few of you have said you will fight on, but only a few. Many, many more have said, let us now seek peace with the Shawnese, lest they come against us and even more strongly. My heart is filled with shame that my ears have heard these words. If it was peace you wanted, why did you not say so when I begged you to do so 5 days ago?" He then asked loudly, angrily, "What do we do now? The Shawnese are coming upon us by 2 routes, far stronger than those we met alone, while we are weakened by the return of our brothers to their distant homes where they will be safe." The contempt was heavy in his voice, and he went on after a brief pause. "So what do we do now? Shall we turn out and fight them? Shall we be men?" In reply, there was only an embarrassed shuffling and eyes which fell away from his stern gaze. At that, some vital spark seemed to go out of the chief. He drew out his blood-stained tomahawk and held it high for all to see, then hurled it savagely to the ground so that nearly the entire head was buried when it hit. In a voice thick with anger, frustration, and shame, he shouted, "Since we are not inclined to fight, we will go and make peace." At those words, there had come a roar of approval, and runners were dispatched at once to Lord Dunmore with treaty proposals. 5 days ago, Cornstalk would have welcomed this, but now it was the saddest day of his life. And so a new treaty had been drawn up, and the army pulled back. It was a treaty, Black Snake warned darkly, which would cause the Shawnee great trouble. Although the whites agreed to stay out of the Ohio country, making the Spele-Wathipi the permanent boundary between Indian and white, they demanded the right to come down the river to settle in the wild lands of western Virginia, the Kentucky lands, which were the sacred hunting grounds of the Shawnee. The Indians had had no choice but to agree, and to further pledge that they would molest no white travelers on the river. In return, the Indians were still to retain the right to cross the river and hunt in their traditional hunting grounds in Kentucky. Blue Jacket had accompanied Cornstalk and Black Snake and the other chiefs and warriors who made up the delegation to seal the peace. Only Logan refused to attend, though he did dictate a speech to be read at the negotiations. It was a speech which had great impact on both the Indians and whites attending the meetings. It was, "I appeal to any white man to say, if ever he entered Logan's cabin hungry, and I gave him not meat. If ever he came cold or naked, and I gave him not clothing. During the course of the last long and bloody war, Logan remained idle in his lodge, an advocate for peace. Nay, such was my love for the whites that those of my own country pointed at me as I passed and said, 'Logan is a friend of the white man.' I had even thought to have lived with you, but for the injuries of one man, Colonel Cresap, that last spring, in cold blood and unprovoked, murdered all of the relatives of Logan, not sparing even women and children. There runs not a drop of my blood in the veins of any living creature. This called on me for revenge. I have sought it. I have killed many. I have fully glutted my vengeance. For my country I rejoice at the beams of peace, but do not harbor the thought that mine is the joy of fear. Logan never felt fear. He will not turn on his heel to save his life. But who is there to mourn for Logan? Not one. But sadness was not limited to Logan alone. All of the Kispokothas mourned the loss of their great chief, and the greatest grief filled the family of Puck Sinois, and this included Blue Jacket. The grief was intensified by the fact that now Puck Sinois' family would move away to take up residence in Chillicothe among the Chalagatha Shawnee and become a part of the family of Chief Blackfish. The oversight and care of a fallen war chief's family, because of his rank and service, always became the peace chief's duty until time and circumstance eased their necessities. And in fact, even though Methotessa would still have no husband, her daughter and 5 sons would have, in Blackfish, a father. It was a sensible arrangement, but Methotessa withdrew in her shroud of grief. Her life had been so much part of Puck Sinois that when he died, something in her died too. She had never loved another man, and she never would. The flame that had lighted her life had gone out. The parting was a sad one, especially since Blue Jacket had not gone along with them. One by one he embraced Methotassa, Chiksika, Tecumseh, Tecumseh, and the triplets, Kumsheka, Suwalasika, and Loalasika. He returned then to Chiksika and placed his hands on the younger man's shoulders. He said nothing, nor did Chiksika, but the bond of affection which flowed between them spoke louder than words. They were brothers, and though now distance would separate them, they would be bound to one another for the rest of their lives. The family was leaving Puck Sinois town forever, taking with them even the name of the village itself. Hereafter, even though it might be called Kispoko Town because it was in the seat of the sept, it was no longer known as Puck Sinois Town. Now it would be known by the name of Shemanito, the new chief of the Kispokotha sept. Hereafter it would be called Black Snake's Town. There was a good reason for Blue Jacket staying behind. Even though he had every right to go with the family of Puck Sinois, the Kispokotha sept not only had a new chief, it also had a new second in command, a strong, fierce, courageous warrior who had fought more vigorously than anyone else in the Battle of Point Pleasant, a man who had won the respect and admiration of Chief Blacksnake himself, a 20-year-old warrior whose name was widely becoming known as Weyawibar Siwa, Blue Jacket.